Trigger warning. This story references domestic violence, sexual violence, and traumatic events. Please take care of yourself while listening. I should have known something was wrong the first time the flowers showed up at my office. They were perfect coral roses, each stem cut to the same precise length, wrapped in tissue that smelled faintly of his cologne. Everyone! Ooh! I smiled. I posted a photo, and I thanked him in front of coworkers like the grateful wife he wanted me to be. On paper, that gesture read like romance. In the house, it read like a ledger entry. The title of this video is literal. The shocking truth. My husband's dark plot uncovered. It isn't melodrama. It's a map of how a life that looked flawless from the outside was being built as a trap from the inside. In the beginning, the trap was invisible small controls, polite suggestions that tightened like a noose. By the time I realized his plan, it was already set in motion. We married young, in our late 20s. Brett was charming in the way practiced charm can be, attentive, generous when it served him, quick with that particular laugh that made people lean in. He knew how to make a house look curated. Neutral rugs, perfectly folded throws, a lamp in every corner that casts just the right glow. People assumed we were a team. They didn't see the accounts he reviewed on my behalf, the weekend plans he vetoed because it would be easier if he handled it, the way he insisted on knowing the password to my phone for emergencies. He framed these things as care. He said, "Let me handle the bills so you don't have to worry." He said, "I'll worry about you, let me make sure you get enough rest." He called them conveniences. Each one felt small. Each one eroded a little autonomy. At first, it was theatrical romance and micromanaging expertise in equal measure. He'd send those flowers every month on the first Friday, always to the office, never a public scene at home. "I like you to be surprised at work," he'd tell me with that half smile. I started to notice the pattern. Deliveries tracked by invoice, receipts that matched the months he was anxious about something, work deadlines, family visits, his mother staying over. He kept logs. I thought it was sweet. Later I saw how much he liked keeping logs more than living inside us. His texts were the softest warning signals. It began with check-ins. "Where are you? Who are you with? What time will you be home?" They multiplied into running commentaries, what I ate, who I spoke to, a critique of a shirt I chose. I learned to breathe around them, to move like a person under observation. When I left the house for errands, he'd ping with exact instructions. "Don't come back without the bread and the blue towel." When I questioned anything, he called me forgetful, dramatic, too emotional. He would say, "I'm only trying to help. I'm the responsible one." He made me feel like a child needing supervision. At night, he would tell me, "I'm protecting you," in a tone that suggested I should be grateful. He installed an app on both of our phones so we always know each other's locations, presented as a safety tool. He called it helpful. It became a leash. I deleted it once in frustration. He reinstated it and said the company required family location services for their group exercise challenge, which only made the deletion look like a child's temper tantrum. After that, my freest moments began to shrink into windows of permission. Money became his arena. He set up joint accounts and then began moving funds without explanation. He would transfer money for household needs and send me screenshots of the transfers. But my name disappeared from the deed to our house in a notarized document he framed as a household simplification. He told me it was for taxes, for insurance, for convenience. The quitclaim deed that removed my name read like a clerical error, according to him. Later, in the court filings and the stacks of subpoenas, I would ask my sister to pull. That deed became one of the most damning artifacts of a larger plan. The systematic erasure of my legal claim to the life we shared. The living room was always immaculate, as if to distract anyone who glanced through our windows, but small things kept accumulating. Receipts for purchases I never authorized, notifications showing he had canceled subscriptions I still used, the occasional Venmo requests from a name I didn't recognize, asking for payment for services. Once, over dinner, he told me we needed a new beneficiary on his life insurance policy. Just to be clear, I remember feeling a cold spread behind my sternum and laughing it off. "Isn't that dramatic?" I asked. He shook his head and said, "It's responsible." The phrase "for our protection" became his hinge. The pattern built slowly, with the same careful repetition of those monthly coral roses. He found ways to make me complicit, signing things together, encouraging me to trust him with the passwords, praising me for being so relaxed now. He framed the process of losing control as gifts. Fewer worries, fewer decisions, more time for myself. When he praised my supposed calm, I felt both relieved and guilty. Relief that someone else was making choices. Guilt, because I couldn't see that those choices were replacing me. Evenings were the strangest collage. He'd tuck a small, neatly folded note into my purse. "Don't forget soprano practice," while also emailing my supervisor suggestions about my schedule under the pretense of support. He would rearrange my closet and call it organizing. He would send me messages that read like micromanaged therapy. "Maybe tonight you should wear something comfortable. It's better for digestion." It was invasive in 1,000 tiny ways, each correction packing a tiny sting. I began cataloging the control without even deciding to. I kept a notebook beside my bed because my instincts told me to leave a trace. At night, between trying to make sense of the affection and the oversight, I'd write petals, texts, password, deed. It felt ridiculous to write down petals like it was a crime, but later those words would line up like evidence. My notebook must have looked like the scribble of someone losing their mind, half-joked lists, shopping notes, reminder except for the way dates matched the invoices, the way I traced a Venmo charge to a name I didn't know, the way a screenshot of the deed change had been slipped into a folder on the shared desktop he insisted was for both of us. The first concrete thing I found that changed the direction of my life was not planted in altruism or love. It was a search history. I was using Brett's laptop one evening. He'd left it on the kitchen counter while he took a the tab was open to a document. I don't know why I clicked. Maybe curiosity had hardened into survival mode. Maybe I was looking for an address and my hand hovered over the keyboard. The search terms stopped my breath. Not romantic or academic. They were precise, cruel in their impersonality. Phrases about how to make a wife submissive, creating compliance, coercive control tactics, combined with searches for hiring someone for home entry and how to avoid forensic traces. There were links to message boards, listings, terms of payment like someone trying to buy silence and a plan in equal measures. I closed the lid so fast the hinge clicked. I remember the sound echoing in the tidy kitchen, like the footfall of someone leaving a room they will not come back to. I didn't know what to do. I felt stupid for even being surprised he had always been organized. And now I saw that organization in its most arranged form. My throat felt full of gravel. I took a picture of the screen with my phone because my hands are clumsy at remembering when I'm scared. The photograph would prove, later, that the curiosity wasn't fanciful. It was evidence. The search history was followed in the margin of that laptop's desktop by a bank notification, a $5,000 transfer. I scrolled and saw a timestamp and a note that read something simple and clinical. Consulting fee. There was a preview of a Venmo username, a name I didn't recognize. Later, when I had the courage to follow those digital breadcrumbs, I discovered the username tied to a sparse account that had one significant outgoing payment and multiple small deposits. The $5,000 wasn't petty cash or a bill. It wasn't groceries or a weekend away. It was payment enough to buy someone else's participation. I remember sitting at the counter with the false table lamp casting a soft blur of light that usually made the kitchen look warm. The lamp did not make me feel warm that night. My mind kept snapping between explanations. Maybe it's an arrangement for a contractor. Maybe it's a business transfer. Maybe he was desperate about some problem I didn't know. Each rationalization sounded like a child's attempt to build sense out of a nightmare. But the searches and the money leaned together like two hands clasped. I tried confronting him once about the laptop because I needed to hear his voice explain away the evidence. He was casual, and his voice had the soft authority I'd heard for years. He said I'd seen something I shouldn't have, and that I was making a big deal of nothing. "You're creating danger where there's none," he told me. The kind of line that dismantled confidence. When I said, "What about the $5,000? He said it was for his consulting work, that the recipient was a colleague. He offered to show me receipts. He offered to log me into his accounts. Each offer was a way to keep me close, while the question did not get answered. He never showed me the details, though he kept saying, "I'll do it later," which is the deferment of those who expect compliance. Another thing changed in my life around that time. Strangers started showing up to our house for maintenance during hours we were supposedly out. They would leave receipts, and Brett would call me afterward with an exaggerated sigh of responsibility, asking, "Did you get the plumber's number?" I would say no, and he would say, "I handled it. It's already paid." It was the pattern of a man building a story for me rather than telling me the story. The ledger of our life filled without my signatures. The more I tried to stay inside my ordinary routine's work, friends. The gym, the more wedged I felt between the public and the private. He would ask who I was having coffee with and then criticize my choice of friends as though I hadn't known them longer than he had. The pressure took shape as isolation. I remember trying to explain that feeling to my sister Jaime over the phone. Jaime, steady, skeptical, and not prone to melodrama, listened, and then said, "Bring me everything. Show me the money movement. Don't throw anything away." Jaime's voice made me feel like a person again. The first time I'd felt like more than an inventory. I tried collecting proof, but Brett's habits made it difficult. He was, in a way, a careful actor. He had spreadsheets with the house numbers and the insurance policies tucked behind innocent folder names. The new life insurance policy I found was written in his name primarily, with a beneficiary listed that wasn't me. When I pressed him, he said it was a formality, to protect us, in case something happened to him. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom like a man who'd rehearsed the line and expected gratitude. His mother, Lorraine, who worshipped him in a way that made you uncomfortable, called it foresight. She quoted a line about God's design when I pushed back, as if religion were an instruction manual for ownership. Her voice was syrupy and unrepentant, and I remember the way Brett's face softened when he listened to her. It suggested more than affection. It suggested alignment. The day I found the deed change, I felt like the house had physically shifted under my feet. I had been looking through our closing documents for a piece of paper to bring to a meeting, and there it was, a quitclaim deed, notarized, with my name removed. It was dated weeks before I'd even known. When I confronted Brett, he said I must have signed without remembering. Memory lapses are powerful gaslighting tools. When you are told one story repeatedly, you begin to mistrust your own sense of ordering. He said, "You must have been distracted. We signed it together at the attorney's." The attorney he named was a contact I'd never met. When I asked for copies of the paperwork, he said he'd get them together. I asked for an explanation. He called it an administrative simplification. He accused me of being dramatic when I cried. I started sleeping lightly, hearing the creaks of the house as if they whispered about what it had become. The lamp on the nightstand that had always given soft light now looked like a surveillance device. My purse felt heavy with the notebook, my phone, the photographs I'd taken. I did what people in my position often do. I compartmentalized the fear so I could keep functioning, at least a little. I went to work and smiled. I went to the grocery store and made lists. But every so often the veneer would chip and I'd sit in the car and sob until my breath stopped shaking. The escalation that finally toppled everything didn't happen in a dramatic movie moment. It was a night that began like 100 others. I was asleep in our room. The house had a low hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic outside. I woke to a noise that did not belong to the house. A muted shuffle. The thump of soft soles against hardwood. The distinct click of a lock being tampered with. I felt the presence in the dock and assumed, absurdly, that it was Brett, returning late. When I reached for the lamp, and my hand brushed the cover, there was more than shadow. The edge of a gloved hand, the glint of a white object, tucked in a pocket. It was then that I smelled something clinical, like the late-night aisles at a drugstore rhubarb. The scent of cold punctuation. I don't narrate this for shock. I narrate it because the specifics are evidence. The intruder carried a condom and disposable gloves, possessions that speak to intent without needing salacious language. He wore a mask. His breathing was shallow and urgent. He made a movement toward the bed that suggested a plan I could not name in the instant but understood enough to know I was not safe. The only word I found in my mouth was, "Get out." He lunged. I reacted. Self-defense is a reaction more than a moral choice in those moments. It's a calculus of survival where reflex and terror direct your body. I fought with whatever I could reach. The lamp tumbled, and the sound of porcelain against tile is something I'm still working to unlearn because it has become the soundtrack of survival. There was a pain-sharp immediate, in a different kind of alarm. The house erupted with noise, the shouting of my own name, through a voice I trusted and then did not. I called 911 with trembling hands because it felt like an anchor to the world I'd known. I told them there had been an intruder. I told them I had defended myself. I told them I didn't want to die in my own bed. The dispatcher asked questions in that precise, practical voice that threads calmness through crises. I gave my name and my address. I gave the facts as I could. When the police arrived, the house was a movie of fluorescent lights and uniforms moving through our rooms like a tide. They asked the routine questions. They asked for an account of events. I told them, haltingly, what had happened. I described the man and what he had been carrying. I told them about the condom, the gloves, the mask, because those details matter. I told them I had defended myself. I told them Brett had been at a work event and could vouch for my account. Brett did come down the stairs in a buttoned shirt and the calm of someone stepping into a pre-written scene. He looked at the police with a composed face and told them a different story. He said he'd been upstairs in the bedroom and found me over the man when she came down. He called me she, as if déjà vu had reprogrammed our pronouns. He described an argument. He used the word accident with the precise inflection of someone inventing plausibility. In my memory, his eyes never met mine. They swept over me the way you look at a painting when you need to catalog brushstrokes for others. He told the officers that something went wrong, that he had only just come down and found me there. He said he called 911. He said he did everything right. They took statements. They took photographs. They asked me to step outside onto the lawn with a blanket over my shoulders while other officers moved through the house with their flashlights. The man who had come into our bedroom was on the floor, in a pool of motion that was clinical in its stillness. I saw a smear of Radon awful, clarifying color and felt my body respond to it as a witness, not a participant. I was shaking so hard I could not pull my legs into the blanket properly. I answered their questions, and all the time Brett's presence was a kind of signal. He was helpful, cooperative, composed. The officers saw his helpfulness. The officers saw the trail he left like an actor pointing at the stage directions. I remember Detective Maurice asking me if I'd been drinking. I told him no. He asked me if we had had arguments. I told him that we had normal disagreements like any couple. He looked at Brett and then at me with a professional evaluation that felt like a gaze scanning evidence for the more believable story. One of the office's detectives, Lauren Hayes, took a more methodical approach. She asked me to explain the sequence of the noises and who had been where. I tried to show her the timeline in my hands. She listened with a patience that felt like oxygen. Brett, meanwhile, moved through the scene like a choreographer. He explained where he'd been, how he had walked down, and found us. He told them he had been in another room, and that things escalated. He made sure to say he had been the one to call the police. It is a skill, staging a narrative, and if I had any illusions about his capacity for performance, they evaporated on that lawn beneath the flashing lights. I was taken to the hospital for evaluation. They documented my injuries and performed the necessary forensic exam. There were questions about the intruder's identity. A neighbor had reported a person in a hood walking away from our property. The man was not conscious when the officers lifted him into an ambulance. Sometimes memory compresses images. In one tight corner of my mind, I kept replaying the angle of the lamp, the way its light struck the bedspread, the way the intruder's features looked in the fractured spill of light. I kept thinking I would wake up from the whole thing and find it a nightmare. I did not. Instead, the next turn in the story arrived with the deputy asking me to come down to the station. I assumed it would be for more photographs, to give a fuller statement. I had not anticipated what Brett had filed moments after the phone call. The story he whispered into the officer's ear about my aggressive temper, about previous episodes. He had framed his account to suggest that my actions were not defensive but uncontrolled. I had never seen it coming. He told them things about me in a way that made them tilt their heads and then look at me with a new script. It was as if the narrative he'd rehearsed placed me in a different role entirely. I was arrested. Hearing that phrase from an officer felt like having someone close the door and lock it behind me. The words were clinical and heavy. You're under arrest for homicide. The handcuffs were cool against my wrists. I remember feeling an odd detachment. The world shifting to a different film, stock grainier, less saturated. My mouth felt dry. I kept telling myself the truth as if repeating it could make it visible to everyone in the room. I defended myself from an intruder. I did not plan any of this, but the presence of Brett in the background, his composed face, his practiced sorrow, changed the way people in authority processed my words. At the station, an officer read me my rights. Paperwork multiplied, like shutters clicking into place. I answered questions about where I had been and what happened. And every answer felt precise because in those moments you're required to be precise. But precision does not always equate to belief. They processed me. They took my fingerprints, my DNA. I was placed in a small holding cell that smelled faintly of bleach and other people's fear. There was a woman in another cell who spoke to me in fragments about the noise in the walls, about waiting, about the absent sun through the bars of the window. Her words were an unintentional mentorship in survival. I sat on the bench, and the blanket they gave me did not warm me. Brett had already sent his mother to the house to look after things, and she swept through the living room with a quiet that felt like triumph, disguised as concern. Loren's voice was all icing soft and judgmental. She told the detectives how frightened she had been, how tragic it was, how the family needed to be together. She asked them to be thorough, and in asking she made a suggestion that would later make everything more complicated. She hinted that there had been troubles I had not shared. Her tone contained both concern and accusation. I was left to grapple with a new kind of betrayal the way the person who should have been my shield had, in that moment, given the officers a version of me that fit a narrative his carefully constructed life story needed. In 100 small ways he had prepared a script to make my actions look irrational. He had been astonishingly good at making the world accept his version of events. Sitting on that metal bench, the cold of the room made more than my bones shiver. It made me think of the coral roses on my desk at work, their petals drooping slightly from the heat of the sun, their colors still deceptively cheerful. I remembered the ledger on the shelf, the life insurance policy that excluded me, the quitclaim deed. I remembered the $5,000 labeled consulting fee on his laptop and the search history. That felt like a preface to a crime. Those digital files were evidence, but sitting in the cell, evidence was paper and numbers and intangible to the people who had already chosen a version of the night. It is odd what you notice when everything collapses, the tiny human details that feel like life. A guard gave me a paper cup with lukewarm coffee and an extra pair of socks because my shoes were soaked from the rain. A woman in the next block whispered the names of a few attorneys she said she used to know. I clung to those small mercies like someone who is trying to remember how to be human. I wouldn't learn for a while how efficiently a prepared narrative can move through a system that trusts costume and composure. I would not yet see how a calculated transfer of money and a carefully worded email could become the backbone of a frame. I was locked into the immediate catastrophe my body, the detritus of the fight, the man's pulse fading and the clinical hush of the processing room. My sister Jaime called and left frantic messages. They passed a phone to me through the window between cells, so I could hear her voice, raw and insistent. "Bring me everything," she said again. "Don't destroy anything." Her voice was a chain in the dark, and I held to it. When the officers took me to the interview room, they placed papers in front of me and asked me to sign statements. I did what I could. I wrote down the sequence of sounds, the way the intruder moved, the position of the lamp, the smell of the gloves. I told them I had tried to protect myself. Brett's version of the incident swiftly supplied .com, and exculpatory sat next to mine, like a theatrical counterpart. The officers spoke in procedural tones. They told me someone would speak to me about bail. They told me there would be time to review evidence. I wanted to tell them about the $5,000 and the search history. But bringing those things up in the interview felt like offering them a map to the very thing I was trying to prove in the absence of belief. I had the picture on my phone. I had the laptop. I had the notebook. I would not be allowed access to Brett's devices yet. The law has rules about evidence, and those rules sometimes move slower than the damage they were meant to prevent. They read me the charges, They explained how the weight of the scene, combined with the narrative provided by the man who shared my house, had influenced the initial decision. Arrests can be made on probable cause. They set a threshold lower than guilt. The words probable cause felt like a machine grinding down the world into pieces that could be rearranged by anyone with the patience to do so. I was placed in a cell and given a number. Night in a jail is a particular kind of silence. It's a silence full of small noises, the scrape of a table, the distant call of a guard, a faucet dripping somewhere, and yet that silence is loud because it allows your thoughts to I thought about the utility of small things, the $5,000, the condom and the gloves, the lamp, the quitclaim deed. If I could prove that the $5,000 had been transferred to or through an account tied to someone who had motive and later appeared at my house, the police would have to look. If I could show that Brett had been researching coercive techniques on his laptop, it would change the arc from accident to conspiracy. The problem was access. Those skeletons were behind his password and his practiced explanations. I slept in fragments. The cell lights dimmed, and I dreamed of the lamp falling and the petals from the coral roses scattering across hardwood. In the morning, the world returned with the clank of keys and a woman calling out my name to be processed for court. I was told I'd see a judge and to be prepared for the initial appearance. People in suits shuffled papers and said things like, "We'll set bail, and we'll look into the scene." They used words that sounded like reassurance, but I recognized the cadence. Institutions moving inexorably, but not necessarily kindly. A public defender was assigned to my case, Rachel Steinsharp, slightly wary, but with an evident intelligence game, to speak with me in a small, bright room. She listened without interruption and then said, "We need everything you've got. Every text, every receipt, the laptop, photo, everything will help." She explained to me how to preserve evidence and told me not to speak to Brett about anything. Her calm competence was the first real star in a sky that had been clouded. She told me she'd file motions and look for inconsistencies. Her work mattered, but she also spoke plainly. "We don't control what they'll find persuasive, but we make sure they have the truth." But that truth needed access to digital evidence. And Brett controlled most of it. He'd made the hardware look communal while keeping the passwords and the narratives private. That night, alone in the cell listening to the fountain of showers and the clink of dinner trays, I felt the magnitude of being unmoored, not just physically separated from my home, but separated from the records and devices that might show the story for what it was. When I think back to that early stretch, before the investigation dug up the rest, I feel the deep, aching exasperation of someone who knows there is a pattern but doesn't yet hold the thread that will unravel it. I knew then that there were pieces that would make sense of the attack and of Brett's involvement: the $5,000 transfer, the search history, the deed, the life insurance policy, but I didn't yet have them in a form that could move the system. I had only a photo and the rising conviction that the man I'd married had built around me a plan to make me disappear in more than one sense. Sitting in a room that smelled of bleach, signing forms and reciting details, the personal terror was only half the story. The other half was the dawning understanding that what happened in our bedroom would not be explained by the obvious facts alone. It would require someone to look behind the surfaces, to check transactions, to subpoena cloud backups, to track accounts across services. It would require a person with an unwillingness to accept the neat story Brett told and a determination to follow digital trails where they led. My sister Jaime would become that person, but at this stage I only knew the shape of betrayal and the immediate sting of being left in a legal system that often privileges the narrative of composure over the messy truth of survival. I was scheduled for an arraignment. I would meet a judge and potentially be required to post bail. The pages of the prosecutor's file were already beginning to stack themselves into a story they preferred. And Brett, with his composed heart and his mother's quietude, walked out of the precinct with a phone full of self-portraits of concern and a perfectly curated tale. I remember the moment the detective closed the folder and said they'd be in touch. Outside the interview room, the fluorescent lights hummed and my hands were empty. I held the photograph of the laptop search page in my palm, like a talisman. I had no idea then that it would become one of the 3 pieces of evidence that would later start the unraveling: the digital searches, the money transfer, and the presence of the intruder with implements that showed intent. I simply sat with the horror of the night, the ache of betrayal, and the dull, cold fact of the handcuffs around my wrists. When I was led back to a cell to wait for my initial appearance, Jaime's face was the first thing I saw through the small glass. She had hair pulled back, a worn jacket, and that furious calm that belongs to people who decide to dismantle injustice with spreadsheets. She held a folder like a shield. She whispered, "Tell me everything! Don't let them gaslight you." Her voice was a boat in the dark. As the steel door clanged and I sank onto the bench, the world narrowed to a few urgent facts. I had defended myself. The man who had helped construct my life had supplied the counter-narrative, and the traces of his orchestration were sitting somewhere in devices and bank accounts he controlled. I had a picture of the search. I had a gut full of fear. I had Jaime. I had Rachel Stein assigned to me. And I had a name to hold up like an accusation. Brett Caldwell. The story's axis was clear. His dark plot had been set in motion long before the door was forced, and the next step would be to prove it. I wasn't yet ready to see the other players' Loren's passive aggression that read like instruction. The unknown man who had done the door breaking, the financial transfers that would later be. For now, the immediate arc ended with me in custody for the very act that kept me alive. The camera of my life, I realized then, had been set to capture only what Brett wanted the world to see. I had to fight to lift the lens and show the footage underneath. If you're following and want to hear how the investigation dug through the digital records and how my sister started pulling threads that led to subpoenas and forensic digs, stick with this story, subscribe, and stay tuned. Jaime arrived like a force. She stood on the other side of the glass with that folder, and that looked the one. That meant she had already started burning things down on paper. She handled the panic differently than I did. Where I kept circling facts, like wounded animals, she started mapping connections. She took my phone, my notebook, the photograph of Brett's laptop. She made lists in the margins of the folder. Venmo usernames, transfer dates, vendor names, that odd consulting fee. She asked me precise questions about account names, debit cards, anything that might be in the margins of our lives. I answered the best I could. We began the work of turning the scatter of my fear into a trail. Rachel Stein moved faster than I expected. The public defender who had spoken to me with that practical steadiness now became a person with files. She filed motions I barely understood, motions for evidence preservation, requests to see any devices collected from the scene, and, crucially, a motion to compel production of bank records tied to the $5,000 transfer. Her language was plain when she spoke to me. We need paper that links the transfer to a person. If we can show the money connected to who did the door, we can change how the police see the night. When she said it, her tone held possibility rather than promise, and for the first time since the arrest I felt my chest unclench just a little. Jaime did the financial digging the way a person with a stethoscope listens to a chest methodically, listening for the irregular beats. She pulled statements through my employer's HR department for the payments the company had processed. She subpoenaed Venmo records with an efficiency that felt criminal in its generosity. The first time she texted me a screenshot that matched the timestamp on Brett's laptop to a Venmo confirmation. I sat in a tiny plastic chair in a courthouse hallway and sobbed because the pieces had started aligning. But the evidence was not straightforward. Brett had consolidated many of the accounts. He had, as he had always done, framed control as convenience. He logged in as both of us, and then tightened the screws. He had accounts that looked shared, but were functionally controlled by him. Some payments passed through intermediary accounts. Some transfers were labeled blankly in ways that only someone paying attention would notice: consulting fee, service, job. Jaime traced patterns: small deposits into a local cash app, then a larger outgoing sum, writing notes of the dates next to each entry like a surgeon marking bones. She found a chain that led to a name we later learned connected to Derek Morrison or to the intermediary that financed him. Rachel pressed for a subpoena to compel Apple and Venmo to produce records. Subpoenas are awkward, blunt instruments. They require an institution to turn internal histories into evidence. The first motions were denied or delayed. Standard procedural friction. There was a frustrating stretch where Brett's devices were held as shared property and law enforcement treated his statements as a part of the record, more persuasive than my frantic photograph. Prosecutors and detectives alike asked themselves what seemed simple to them. Whose story was more consistent with the scene? Brett's composure? Or mine, covered in the rawness of survival? Detective Lauren Hayes, who had struck me early on as methodical, started to show the kind of curiosity that mattered. She listened to Jaime and Rachel differently than some of the other officers. Detective Maurice had been polite but quick to accept the version that fit the obvious performance. Hayes dug into the bank timestamps and then reluctantly at first asked for forensic support. She pushed the idea of seeking backups, the cloud accounts that might undermine the wipe and forget strategy the conspirators seemed to have used. That suggestion made sense to someone who had been in rooms like ours. People often erase local devices while backups linger in cloud archives. There was resistance. The DA's office had to be persuaded. Prosecutor Kristen Yale read the file and held it like a judge considering a hinge. At first, she seemed conservative about how much to challenge. Charges had been filed. The prosecutors had to honor a number of obligations. But as more records dripped into the file, and Jaime kept producing small, clarifying ledgers, the kind of documents a person could not fake because they were anchored to payroll dates, and vendor confirmation, Zeal began to ask different questions. She asked for subpoenas specifically directed at cloud storage providers, for cell provider logs, and for any backups associated with Derek's device. We hit a wall when it came to the assailant's phone. Initial forensics showed a factory reset. It looked, at first glance, like intentional erasure. Whoever held the device had scrubbed it. A factory reset can feel like finality. For a while, it looked like malicious erasure had won. I remember Jaime pacing the kitchen of my sister's apartment late into the night, phone in hand, whispering, "There has to be a backup. There has to be a backup." The words were not supplication so much as a mantra. Then came the small miracle of legal persistence. A subpoena to Apple that had initially stalled was refiled with more precise language, with the support of Detective Hayes, and with pressure from Rachel and Jaime. Apple's policy of retaining certain backups for limited windows worked in our favor. A forensic specialist eventually told Rachel in a corridor that certain iCloud snapshots had been preserved even when a device was wiped. Because cellular providers and cloud services sometimes keep incremental snapshots for it was a narrow avenue, technically complicated, but it existed. When the cloud records came through, they felt, in that moment, like sunlight. The phone had been factory reset, but the cloud backup contained a series of messages, photos, and a short video. The texts were explicit, not in a lurid way, but in the kind of planning that left little room for interpretation. There were messages with timestamps tying Derek to discussions about entry, mentions of cash, and exchanges with a username that matched the Venmo entry from Brett's laptop. There were photos showing Derek with items matching the description of what he'd had at our house: gloves in a white pharmacy bag, a box similar to the one used to conceal a condom, the face partially obscured by a dark hoodie in the insecure light of a motel room. There was also a clip, short, grainy, that showed a brittle, rehearsed conversation between Derek and a voice that coordinated timing. The most devastating piece was a screenshot saved in the cloud, a text thread with a coded alphanumeric sequence that matched the keypad code for the side door lock that had allowed entry that night. That code was unique to our house, changed periodically, and known only to Brett and Lorraine. The cloud also contained evidence directly tying a Venmo username to the same events. The $5,000 transfer that had haunted me now showed up as a payment to an account used in messages to Derek. Jaime printed everything and arranged it in a binder. For the first time, the proof had the shape of a story, a string that connected Brett's searches, the money, the code, and the man at my door. When Detective Hayes and the prosecutor reviewed the cloud backup, they started to see how the earlier interpretations had been incomplete. The timeline shifted. It wasn't just a domestic altercation that might be tragic and ambiguous. The messages suggested coordination. They suggested intent. They suggested that the intruder was not random. The DA's office convened an internal meeting. I remember hearing that there were quiet calls between Rachel and Kristen Yale, and a day later, the tenor of the investigation changed. Charges against me were not immediately vacated legal processes move in measured ways, but the language in the files shifted. There was movement toward viewing me as a survivor rather than a suspect. The investigators reopened their focus on Brett and Lorraine. Arrest warrants followed 4 individuals who had been on the periphery. The name of Derek Morrison, the man who had come through our door, was now part of a broader ledger. A hired assailant with messages, a payment trail, and a code that tied him to our home. Crystal Morrison, Derek's widow, became an unexpected and crucial witness. I met her months later under grim circumstances at a deposition arranged by the prosecutor's office with Jaime and Rachel in the room. She told a story that was small and terrible in the most human of ways. Derek had pulled money and odd jobs to cover his own debts after he shipped out of town. How he'd taken on work that scared her in the way a person might fear a job that extracted more than it paid. She had grief and regret layered on top of knowing things that were useful to the case. She confessed small acknowledgments of Derek's conversations, little details that corroborated the cloud messages. She was not an actress in a courtroom drama. She was a woman who had lost a husband and wanted to tell the truth she had avoided. Her testimony was sober and halting and powerful because it had no performative sheen. The prosecutor, Kristen Yale, made a choice that felt enormous then, but was rooted in the evidence stacked against Brett and Lorraine. She filed to drop the charges against me. The motion cited the cloud backups, the Venmo trail, the screenshots, and the keypad code. That moment the prosecutor saying, in effect, we were wrong about this, was not the end. It was the pivot. It didn't erase the nights in the cell, the humiliation of sitting in a courtroom while I was still under suspicion, but it did change the arc of the story so profoundly that I needed to sit down with Jaime in a little coffee shop and let the relief catch up. There were arrest warrants issued for people implicated by the recovered communications. Brett and Lorraine was the mother-in-law's tone syrupy and persuasive would later be recorded in other documents as part of the pattern. Detectives served warrants on properties connected to Lorraine's small business. The civil consequences grew at the same time. Jaime and Rachel argued that, beyond criminal liability, there was a civil duty to account for the damage done. We filed a civil suit for damages. Civil law is not criminal law. Different standards apply, different burdens of proof. But, where criminal courts require guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, civil courts weigh a preponderance of evidence. Jaime's spreadsheets and Rachel's depositions were relentless. We argued that Brett's actions, changing the deed, shifting insurance, arranging payments to outside actors, constituted a coordinated plan to assert control and then to manufacture a path that could remove me from the legal picture if necessary. The suit named Brett and Lorraine. It pressed for restitution for the financial harm, the emotional harm, and the cost of rebuilding a life after being accused of homicide. The trial was, against my will, public. Courtrooms have a peculiar way of making private suffering into something porous. The morning of the trial I sat with Dr. Patricia Chinta, trauma therapist who had, by then, become my steady in ways Jaime and Rachel could not. Patricia had taught me how to name my body's responses without letting them stage manage my entire life. She gave me a breathing exercise in the hallway, not for comfort, but to steady my voice. She told me that testimony would be an act of telling, not of proving every nuance. You can't carry everyone into the room with you, she said. You can only bring the truth you know. Crystal Morrison testified carefully about Derek's actions and about the cash transfers she had noticed. Jaime walked the jury through the financials in a way that was both technical and human. She pointed to payroll dates, 2 snapshots of Venmo entries, to the deed that had slipped my name away. She explained the $5,000, showed the time-stamped transaction, and then connected it to Derek's messages. It was meticulous, and it had a rhythm that made a jury lean forward. The widow's testimony and Jaime's charts were supplements to the cloud's direct contents, the screenshots, the videos, the messages. One clip, brief and cracked, showed Derek exchanging a confirmation for a payment with someone whose messages matched Brett's phrasing. The jurors saw the keypad code and heard Detective Hayes describe how that specific entry point had been used. It was not theatrical. It was records and human voices supporting them. On paper, the forensic evidence did what it couldn't in the early shock. It translated motive into traceable action. The civil verdict did not promise criminal punishment. A jury found in my favor on several counts, awarding damages designed to rectify, as much as money can, the cost of what had been taken. My sense of safety, my finances, and my reputation. The award placed financial pressure on Brett and Lorraine. Lorraine's small business, already leveraged and fragile, faced liens related to judgment enforcement. Bankruptcy proceedings followed for some of the associated entities. These were not triumphal scenes. They were the slow mechanics of accountability that a civil judgment initiates. Brett, whose life had been carefully curated to look stable, found himself cut off from access he had once taken for granted. The courts enforced separation. The legal ties that bound our names on documents and policies were severed or adjusted in ways that made physical and financial distance possible. I need to be precise here. A civil win is not the same as criminal conviction. No prison door slammed for the people who had coordinated the entry in a way that gave me physical danger. Arrest warrants had been issued. The criminal process continued at its own pace, but the civil judgment allowed me to begin re-entry into a life where I could make choices again. That legal separation was practical freedom even if it did not erase the memory of the night. The aftermath of the courtroom was prosaic in many ways. There were lawyers, letters, and the slow accounting of damages. There were negotiations and settlements, lawyers being paid, and liens placed on business assets. Those financial moves had human effects. Lorraine's business declared bankruptcy. Employees were left unsure. Vendors were unpaid. Justice in this form is messy and affects people beyond the marquee names. I didn't celebrate the collapse of someone else's livelihood, even a person who had been part of an orchestrated plan against me. I acknowledged it as consequence. More important than the legal arc was the personal work. My body had the memory of a night where instinct had overridden fear. That memory lived in muscle and reflexes. And legal vindication could not speak to the way my heart reacted to a hinge or a shadow. Dr. Patricia Chin began working with me weekly. She taught me how to name the flash without letting it decide the rest of my day. She explained that healing was not linear. She gave me a workbook, small tasks to pull me back into ordinary actions. Make the bed, then make another meal. Do the laundry, then take a short walk. She called them micro-truths. Tiny commitments that said, you still live here. Shauna, my cellmate from early on, remained a presence even after we left that gray block of holding cells behind. She wrote me a letter from the place she'd been sent for parole hearings. She told me to be patient with the way trust enters a room again. She taught me a simple rule. If you startle when someone approaches, tell them you are startled. Let them know your body still remembers. It was a small instruction about consent and restoration. It helped. I began the painfully slow process of rebuilding. I moved into a small, sunlit apartment that fit the scale of someone learning to live with less spectacle. The rugs did not have to be neutral or curated. I made the space practical. I bought a small used table and a lamp that gave me the exact kind of soft light that did not make me feel watched. I went back to work gradually. Some coworkers others had kept their distance, unsure of how to reconcile the headlines with the person they knew. The micro moments of ordinary life, paying a bill on my own, booking a dentist appointment without texted commentary, walking to the market and choosing a brand of coffee were small acts of sovereignty. One of the best decisions, impulsive and healing, was adopting Riot. Riot was the only three-legged cat in a rescue who seemed to understand the language of people who'd been through doors. He had a limp that made him tilt his head sideways when he chased a ribbon. He slept on my chest sometimes, his little heart beating like an anchor. Riot was not a pet that cured me. He was a companion that kept me in the present. His presence said, in small, warm ways, that the house was not a ledger to be read. It could be a place of care. Work resumed with difficulty. There were gaps in my resume that had to be explained. I found a new job in a smaller firm that valued my attention to detail and my capacity to stay steady under pressure. Honed in courtrooms and long nights with Jaime. The money was modest, but steady, and the routine helped cement a life that did not revolve around the man who had tried to write my narrative for me. There were encounters I had to navigate. The streets of the city felt narrower for a while because my brain measured distance in potential threats. Dr. Chin introduced me to exposure exercises that began with small steps, standing in a crowded place for 5 minutes, then 10. She scaffolded me back toward feeling ordinary. It was slow, it was deliberate. One afternoon, months after the civil verdict, I saw Brett in a grocery store. It was a banal moment. Canned tomatoes and fluorescent lights. The slow hum of carts. He was a few aisles away, browsing. For a second the old reflex surged hard in throat, the room narrowing. I could have turned away or hurried. Instead, I let the scene unfold like a documentary I no longer wanted a role in. He glanced my way, his face going through the practiced masks I'd seen before. Concern, then confusion, then a kind of polite embarrassment. He was, in that moment, a person in a shopping cart aisle. I had a choice about how to engage the scene. I walked toward the produce section, past a stand of tomatoes ripening under the lights, and I thought about how the title of this video fits the arc of what happened. The shocking truth had been uncovered not because of an explosive confession, but because of lines of numbers, the stubborn preservation of data, and people who refused to accept a tidy performance as the whole story. My life had been invaded. The invasion had been planned. Evidence showed it. The truth did not undo the night. It did, however, allow me to reclaim ordinary gestures. Buying fruit, choosing pasta, not watching every shadow as if it were an omen. I passed Brett, and he avoided meeting my eyes. For a moment I felt the old wish, some internal petition that wanted him to look broken, to mirror the damage he'd done. But instead a different gesture rose up. I smiled, small and neutral, and kept walking. It was not forgiveness in any grand sense. It was a refusal to let the man who had built a trap set the terms for my daily motions. His plot had been uncovered. The legal consequences had landed in civil arenas, and I had rebuilt enough to choose how to respond. Life after the legal theater was not cosmetic redemption. Therapy meant leaning into tasks I had once taken for granted. Grocery lists, social calendars, the mundane comedy of paying rent. I learned to trust my decisions again, what to buy, where to go, who to call. I watched Riot attempt to climb a chair and felt a small, fierce love that was not tied to anyone's narrative but my own. I think often about the people who made the unraveling possible. Jaime, who refused to see this as noise. Rachel, who took careful steps through procedure and subpoenaed the things no one wanted to wait for. Detective Hayes and Detective Maurice, to their credit, who did not let the earliest interpretation freeze the investigation. Prosecutor Kristen Yale, who read the cloud records and altered course. Crystal Morrison, whose willingness to testify about Derek put human detail beside forensic trace. Dr. Patricia Chin, Shona, and the small fellowship of friends who helped me resettle into a life where I could breathe. Those people were not dramatic. They were persistent. Persistence is quieter than drama and, in the end, more effective. There are practical takeaways. I want to share lessons I wish I'd known before any of this began. Keep copies of documents that matter. Keep a paper trail. Make sure someone you trust knows how to access key accounts if you are ever in danger. Don't let convenience become control. If you sense something off, trust that something in your body is tracking it. Small things add up. If you have a sibling or a friend who will count receipts with you, hold on to them like a lifeline. And I do not want to end this as a story of legal triumph only. There was, for me, a deep interior repair that mattered as much as the court rulings. I relearned how to accept care that did not require me to be small. I learned to set boundaries and to insist on explanations that made sense, not just excuses that sounded plausible. I had to build endurance for nuance. The world is messy. Justice is slower than we'd hope. Healing is not a single moment but a series of mornings you decide to get up and make coffee anyway. I will not promise that every person in a similar situation will find the same outcomes. The law is not a guarantee, and not every file will land the same way. What I can say is this: documentation matters. Persistence matters. A sister who will make calls at 3 in the morning matters. A public defender who believes you matters. People who insist on following digital threads matter. Systems can be blind, but they can also be corrected when evidence is presented clearly and when someone refuses to stop asking questions. Riot is asleep on my lap as I say this. His three-legged silhouette is a little laughable, and impossible, and steady. He purrs as if the world is foolish for being so loud. I go to therapy. I am employed. I sleep in my apartment without a door code changing under me. I am careful, not cowardly. My life has the small elements of peace plant on the windowsill, the exact brand of coffee in the pantry, a neighbor I wave to in the hall. That ordinariness feels like triumph because for so long, someone else had tried to build a life for me that kept me under observation. The title of this video is literal, The Shocking Truth, My Husband's Dark Plot Uncovered. It was shocking because the plot was muffled in kindness and usefulness. It was dark because it organized resources, money, connections, a mother-in-law's pious complicity into a scheme that put me in danger. Uncovering it required tiny acts of defiance. A photograph of a search page, a subpoena refiled, a sister who tracked Venmo entries. It required witnesses who were willing to tell a truth that hurt. That truth is now public record. It won't make the night less real, but it allowed me to continue. If you or someone you know is experiencing control, coercion, or domestic abuse, please look in the description for resources and hotlines that can help. You are not alone. Professional help matters. Therapists, lawyers, forensic accountants, and community matters too. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who might need to hear that persistence and evidence can change a narrative. Thank you for listening to how the pieces came together and for honoring the careful, quiet work it took to show what had been hidden. I am rebuilding. The man who plotted against me is no longer the axis of my life. He has been exposed, and the rest of my life is finally mine again.